Okay, so let's dive in. Today we're taking a deep look at something that, well, it generates a lot of heat, especially on college campuses: political correctness in academia.
Right. And for this deep dive, our main source is Sandra Dzenis' book, Political Correctness in Academia, a Public Choice Analysis.
Yeah, and the mission really is to use this public choice theory lens to try and unpack why PC has become such a, well, such a significant force in academic culture and practice.
Mm-hmm. It's definitely prominent. You see it talked about constantly, often, quite notoriously at top universities, UK, US, Canada.
And people on all sides acknowledge it's there, even if they fight over what it means.
Exactly. And that's interesting right off the bat, isn't it? The term PC itself.
How so?
Well, you hear it used almost like a weapon, a sarcastic jibe, often by critics saying it signals growing intolerance.
Yeah, that's definitely a common usage.
But then in other contexts, it can be used positively, like someone's being, socially conscious or appropriately sensitive.
So the very term is loaded. It's contested ground from the start.
Absolutely. Which tells you something about the whole debate.
Okay, so it's not simple. Where, according to the source, did this whole thing really start, this phenomenon in academia?
Well, the book traces a lot of it back to the U.S., partly linked to the country's history, its multi-ethnic society, and various social movements that came out of that.
Like civil rights, women's rights.
Exactly. Black rights, women's rights, LGBTQ plus rights, those kinds of movements played a role in the background.
And the term itself, political correctness, has its own history, doesn't it?
It does, and it's quite revealing. Apparently, it started back in the 70s, but within the New Left.
As a critique.
Yeah, as a form of self-critique, like policing their own ranks, checking for ideological purity, that sort of thing.
Ah, interesting. Not how it's mostly used now.
Not at all. By the 80s, the mainstream media picked it up, and, well, it flipped. It became an external critique, used mostly by conservatives and classical liberals against the left.
So the original users kind of lost control of the term.
Completely. And that shift really framed how we talk about it now.
Okay, so how do defenders, people who support PC measures, see them? Things like speech codes, affirmative action, changing language.
Well, from their perspective, these are necessary tools. Tools to fight social inequalities, to combat discrimination, to stop intolerant behavior.
So it's about promoting equality.
Yes, and supporting a broader political agenda aimed at essentially managing social life to achieve those more equal outcomes.
And we see examples, right, like Sweden introducing the gender-neutral pronoun hen.
Or that German professor suggesting professics. Those are sort of concrete manifestations of that impulse to modify language for social goals.
Okay, but then the critics, they see it very differently.
Oh, completely the opposite. For critics, these very same measures are signs of growing intolerance. They see it as shutting down debate, stifling free expression.
And the argument is that if you disagree, you just get labeled.
That's the claim, yeah.
Yeah.
Accusations of sexism, racism, homophobia thrown around to silence dissent. And they argue that universities, which they feel should be about pursuing truth and judging based on achievement,
have become politicized.
right, politicized by left-wing agendas, influencing everything from the curriculum to who gets admitted or hired.
Okay, so that sets the stage. We have this phenomenon, PC, it's real, it's debated, strong views on both sides. Now let's bring in this public choice theory framework. How does that help explain things?
Right, so public choice theory, or PCT, it basically uses the tools of economics to look at political behavior.
Economics, like supply and demand.
Sort of, but more the underlying assumptions, like assuming individuals are, well, rational actors, meaning they're primarily driven by their own self-interest, trying to get the best outcome for themselves. It applies that logic to voters, politicians, bureaucrats, everyone involved in the political or public sphere.
That sounds a bit cynical, maybe, compared to the idea of public service for the common good.
It's definitely less romantic. PCT tends to view government and public institutions not as these sort of benevolent seekers of the public good, but more like, well, instruments. They respond to demands from different groups, kind of like a market responds to consumers, but through political channels.
So politicians want votes, like businesses want profits.
That's the classic analogy from Downs, yeah. And bureaucrats, including university administrators in this view, aren't just neutral implementers.
They have their own interests, too.
Exactly. The theory suggests they're often trying to maximize things like their department's budget or their own influence and power.
Okay, self-interest is a key driver. PCT also talks about rational ignorance, right? What's that?
Yeah, that's a really interesting one. Basically, it suggests that for an individual voter, the cost of becoming really well informed about complex political issues.
Is high. Takes a lot of time and effort.
Right. And the perceived benefit, well, your one vote doesn't usually change the outcome, so the cost often outweighs the benefit.
Meaning it's actually rational not to bother becoming deeply informed on everything.
From a purely self-interested cost-benefit perspective, yes, it's rational to remain somewhat ignorant about politics.
Okay, that makes a kind of intuitive sense.
Yeah.
But then there's rational irrationality. That sounds like a contradiction.
It does, doesn't it? That's Brian Kaplan's idea. It goes a step further than just ignorance.
How so?
It suggests people might actually prefer to hold certain beliefs, even if those beliefs are flawed or factually wrong.
Why would they do that?
Because the personal cost of holding a wrong political belief is often basically zero. It doesn't directly harm you most of the time. But holding the belief might provide psychological benefit.
Like feeling good about yourself or fitting in with your group.
Exactly. Feel-good policies or beliefs that signal your identity or solidarity. So you might have, as Kaplan puts it, preferences over beliefs themselves, not just policies. It feels good to believe certain things, regardless of the evidence.
And this isn't random error. People tend to be irrational in predictable ways.
That's the argument. Kaplan points to what he calls systematic biases, like people being overly suspicious of markets or foreigners, or favoring policies that just seem to create jobs even if they're inefficient.
What about highly educated people, like academics? Surely they're less prone to this.
Well, there's this concept of sophistication bias. Research suggests that politically informed people who know a lot about politics,
Aren't necessarily more objective.
in fact, they might be better at rationalizing and defending their existing beliefs. They use their knowledge not to find the truth, but to argue more effectively for what they already think.
Wow. So more information doesn't automatically mean less bias.
It can actually mean more motivated reasoning, more digging in your heels. And in academia, this could mean aligning more easily with dominant norms, like equality-based norms, especially if your colleagues reinforce those views.
Okay, so we've got these tools. Self-interest, rational ignorance, and irrationality, systematic and sophistication biases. How do we apply these now to understand PC in academia? Where does PCT take us?
Well, one really important application is looking at interest groups. Using Manker-Olson's ideas, his logic of collective action.
Olson, right, he talked about group size and effectiveness.
Exactly. His core idea is that large, spread-out groups with diffuse common interests. Think about everyone who benefits from, say, maximum free speech. They find it really hard to organize and act collectively.
Why that?
The free rider problem. Everyone in the group gets the benefit if the goal is achieved, whether they contributed effort or money or not.
So it's tempting to let others do the work.
Precisely. Why pay the cost if you get the benefit anyway? So mobilization is difficult for these large, diffuse groups.
Groups.
Small groups, especially if they're homogenous and have concentrated interests where the benefits are large for each member, they're much better at organizing. It's easier to coordinate, easier to see who's contributing, and everyone has a stronger incentive. Think lobbyists for a specific industry.
Okay, so how does this apply to PC in academia?
The argument in the source is that these equality advocating groups on campus, even if they claim to speak for large constituencies like all women or all members of an ethnic group.
Function more like small focus groups.
Organizationally, yes. They often share a strong common identity, have very specific goals, and this shared identity and focus makes it easier for them to form effective pressure groups.
Compared to, say, a hypothetical group of academics from all different fields, just advocating for abstract, free inquiry.
Exactly. That latter group is large, diverse, with diffuse benefits, classic Olson collective action problem. The identity-focused groups have an organizational advantage.
Okay, that's one angle, the interest group dynamics. What else does PCT suggest?
Another key concept is rent-seeking.
Rent-seeking. I usually associate that with economics, like companies lobbying for subsidies or regulations that hurt competitors.
It's the same basic idea. Rent-seeking, as economists like Tullock or Kruger defined it, is using resources, time, effort, political connections not to create new value, but to capture existing value or gain special advantages, rents, through the political or regulatory process.
And these rents might even be socially wasteful overall.
Often, yes. The effort spent lobbying could have been used productively elsewhere. Now, how does this apply to universities?
Good question. They aren't typical markets.
No, but the argument is that academic markets aren't perfectly competitive either. This allows for rents to exist. And certain parts of the university, like specialized academic programs.
Like ethnic studies or gender studies programs.
Yes, the source suggests that, viewed through a PCT lens, these can sometimes function a bit like de facto unions.
Unions? How? What rents are they seeking?
Well, the book suggests several ways. They might try to create barriers to entry, maybe implicitly favoring hiring faculty who belong to the group being studied. There's a study mentioned that found high percentages of faculty in certain ethnic studies departments were from that ethnicity.
Okay, controlling who gets in. What else?
Linking their program's funding or importance to campus activism, or, potentially, lowering academic standards in some courses to boost enrollment and demonstrate demand, which helps justify their budget or expansion.
And the rents they gain from this activity would be, what? Money? Jobs?
Could do several things. Material advantages, like securing government grants specifically targeted at PC-related topics, getting academic positions for people aligned with their views.
And intellectual influence, too.
Yes, promoting their specific theories or perspectives by limiting the platform for competing ideas, gaining power within the broader university structure.
And the downside, according to this PCT analysis,
Is that you get a potential misallocation of resources. Academics might invest time and energy in this rent-seeking defending their turf, promoting existing paradigms instead of focusing solely on producing groundbreaking, innovative research.
which represents a deadweight loss for society. We're paying for activity that isn't necessarily pushing knowledge forward efficiently.
That's the argument, yes. It frames the incentives in a very particular and perhaps uncomfortable way.
Okay, that covers interest groups and rent-seeking academics. What about the university administration? They seem crucial in implementing PC policies.
Absolutely. And PCT has things to say about bureaucrats, too. A key point is that in many public bureaucracies, including universities, it's really hard to measure output or efficiency.
Unlike a private company where you have profits as a clear metric.
Exactly. So what motivates administrators in this model? Again, self-interest.
Maximizing their department's budget. Their own influence?
Often, yes. Niskanin's model suggests budget maximization. Others, like Dunleavy, suggest focusing on policy influence or building empires. Agencies specifically tasked with things like equality or diversity,
Might have an incentive to find more inequality to fix.
or at least to propose more initiatives. From this perspective, they might oversupply equality measures because it justifies their existence, their budget, their staffing levels.
And they might align themselves with political trends to gain favor.
Yes, aligning with the prevailing political or moral winds, maybe set by government sponsors or powerful campus groups, can help them secure important roles and resources. People who are already activists on these issues might naturally gravitate towards these administrative roles, too.
So how does this administrative self-interest lead to supporting specific PC measures like speech codes or affirmative action?
Well, implementing these things can be a rational strategy for administrators. It helps appease those well-organized identity-based interest groups we talked about.
Avoiding protests, bad press, demands for resignation.
Exactly. It can be the path of least resistance to maintain stability and protect their own positions and the institution's reputation, at least in the short term. Signaling support for PC becomes a way to manage campus politics and safeguard their budgets.
So it might be less about deep ideological commitment and more about pragmatic self-preservation.
The PCT framework suggests the incentive structure pushes them in that direction, regardless of personal beliefs. And importantly, administrators can also use tools like speech codes strategically.
How so?
Even if the legal standing of some codes is shaky, especially in the U.S. with the First Amendment, the threat of investigation or administrative punishment can be enough to chill speech.
Ah, so they can use the codes to silence criticism? Maybe criticism of their own growing administrative power or specific diversity programs?
That's a potential outcome highlighted in the source. It can be a tool to manage dissent and consolidate administrative control. And this ties into the observation.
About the massive growth in university administrators compared to faculty over recent decades.
Precisely. That trend is certainly consistent with a model where administrators have incentives and the means to expand their own domains.
Okay, let's shift to the faculty more broadly.
Yeah.
Beyond those potentially in rent-seeking programs, how do the rest of the faculty fit into this PCT picture? What does the data show about their ideology?
While the data cited is pretty stark, it shows a significant ideological imbalance in academia, especially in fields like the social sciences and humanities.
Heavily skewed towards the left or liberal side.
Yes, multiple studies point to a large majority identifying as left liberal and a real underrepresentation of conservatives, particularly in the US, but also noted in the UK and Canada.
So if most faculty lean left, how does PC gain traction if, as you mentioned, the really driving force might be a smaller activist group?
That's a key question. The source suggests that the academics most actively pushing PC are likely a minority within that broader left-leaning faculty. They're often described as progressive activists, highly engaged, and perhaps less concerned about potential PC overreach compared to other liberals.
And their success partly goes back to that Olson idea. They function as a concentrated interest group.
Yes, their minority status, paradoxically, might help their organizational effectiveness in seeking rents or pushing their agenda within the larger, more diffuse academic body.
But why do the others, the majority of left liberal faculty who might not be activists, often seem to go along with it, or at least not actively resist, even if they have private reservations?
PCT points to the costs and benefits for the individual faculty member. There are several potential factors at play.
Like what?
Well, genuine sensitivity to accusations of discrimination is one. Nobody wants to be seen as prejudiced. But critically, there's the fear of negative consequences for speaking out.
Real career costs.
Yes. Concerns about getting published, getting tenure, future job prospects, being ostracized socially or professionally. This can lead to significant self-censorship.
You just keep quiet if you disagree.
Or you moderate your views. Academics are also aware that gatekeepers, journal editors, peer reviewers often lean left, so you might subconsciously or consciously tailor your work to fit perceived expectations.
And things like the Journal of Controversial Ideas, allowing anonymous submissions. That seems like evidence people are afraid of the consequences.
It certainly suggests a perceived need for protection, doesn't it? That some academics feel they can attach their name to certain ideas without risking significant professional backlash.
What about when pushback does happen? The source mentions the Noah Carl case.
Right, where his fellowship was terminated following protests. That illustrates the potential high costs facing campaigns, often framed in moral terms, focusing on alleged harm rather than engaging the research directly.
But some established academics did defend him.
Yes, people like Peter Singer. Which shows that for some, principles like academic freedom can override the personal costs, but it often takes established figures to feel secure enough to do so. It also shows the counter-arguments often have a moral dimension, too.
And mobilizing a large-scale anti-PC movement among faculty is difficult.
Extremely difficult, according to this model. Again, the collective action problem looms large.
Are you writing?
Yes. Why stick your neck out and pay the potential career cost when you can benefit if someone else successfully pushes back? Plus, many moderate or traditional liberals might agree with the basic anti-discrimination goals of PC, even if they dislike the tactics or excesses.
So they're not motivated enough to mount a major challenge.
Their dissatisfaction might not outweigh the perceived risks and organizational hurdles.
Okay, let's talk about how PC gets embedded structurally. Curriculum and hiring seem key.
Definitely. You see the institutionalization clearly in efforts to diversify curricula, change reading lists away from the traditional dead white males canon.
And this is often framed as a moral imperative.
Yes, to challenge Eurocentrism, male dominance, and so on. There's also the influence of certain postmodern ideas.
Suggesting knowledge isn't universal but tied to identity.
Right, leading to demands for curricula that speak to student-specific identities. Think about mandatory diversity courses that many U.S. universities now have.
And administrators or academics might see strategic advantages in pushing this.
The source suggests they might politicize diversity demands to achieve other goals, like getting resources to start a new program in, say, non-Western philosophy.
How does the curriculum itself influence student activism?
Well, the narratives taught in some courses, particularly around identity, oppression, and social justice.
To energize students.
Yes, they can fuel demands for further changes on campus, sometimes including censorship of speakers or ideas deemed harmful. Student protesters often appeal directly to identity and experienced injustice.
Which gives them a strong incentive. More direct than abstract principles.
Exactly. They're arguing for things that feel personal and provide direct psychological or group benefits. That makes their mobilization potentially more potent than academics arguing for, say, abstract open inquiry, which offers less immediate, more diffuse rewards.
And hiring practices, affirmative action, diversity initiatives.
These also institutionalize PC priorities. The focus is typically on diversifying based on gender and ethnicity, not necessarily viewpoint or ideology.
And the university's motivation from a PCT view.
Partly satisfying those organized identity groups to avoid trouble, but also potentially rent-seeking accessing public or private funds specifically designated for diversity efforts,
Creating a kind of regulatory capture situation.
where the policies effectively shield or benefit members of certain identity groups from open competition, framed within a diversity rationale.
And the data shows increased diversity, though maybe slower at the top levels.
Yeah, the trends in the US, UK, Canada show increases in female and minority representation, though progress varies. Examples like race-conscious admissions in the US or specific funding for BME postgrads in the UK are concrete examples of these policies in action.
Okay, let's try to pull this all together, synthesizing this public choice perspective on PC and academia. What's the main takeaway?
I think the core insight is that it shifts the explanation. Instead of just seeing PC as an ideology clashing with other ideologies, it frames it as the outcome of rational, self-interested behavior by different actors within the specific incentive structure of the university.
So it emphasizes the mechanics rather than just the ideas, highlighting how small focus groups, PC activists, certain programs, diversity administrators have organizational advantages.
Exactly. Following Olson's logic, they act as effective collective actors, and they use tools like rent-seeking and political influence within the university.
To shape research agendas, the curriculum, hiring, speech rules, aligning them with PC goals.
Right. And while these goals are wrapped in ideological language equality, social justice, the PCT lens, suggests they also serve concrete professional and material interests for those involved. Funding, jobs, power, influence.
Meanwhile, the broader interests, like unfettered free speech, are treated as public goods.
Yes, making them vulnerable to the free rider problem. The groups advocating for them are larger, more diverse, harder to mobilize effectively compared to the concentrated interests pushing PC.
And administrators find that PC initiatives can actually align with their own interests in expanding bureaucracy and control.
That's part of the picture, too. It creates this dynamic where the incentives for key players tend to favor the growth and entrenchment of PC measures.
So PCT offers a reason why PC became so prominent, focusing on these underlying incentives and structural advantages. Rather than just saying it's a left-wing takeover, it's more about how the system itself channels behavior.
Precisely. It analyzes the process and the incentives that lead to the observed outcomes.
Now, the source, based on this analysis, reaches a pretty stark conclusion about the prospects for change from within.
Yes, it suggests that significant change, like rolling back speech codes or fundamentally challenging the PC status quo, is unlikely to come purely from university staff themselves. The internal incentives just don't favor it strongly enough.
Implying that change, if it happens, would likely need to come from outside pressure.
That's the implication. Legislative action, government intervention, perhaps changes in funding models. Some form of external force might be needed to alter the internal incentive structure.
Which leaves us with a rather provocative question to ponder, doesn't it? If internal change is unlikely, what does that mean for the future of genuine intellectual diversity and open debate on campus? And if external pressure is the only route, where could it realistically come from? And what might its own unintended consequences be? Definitely something to think about.